All right, to continue on with our discussion about assessment, I just want to make a connection from what we talked about in the first video going forward. So remember, we talked about performance assessment being the most authentic way to assess student understanding or learning, right? So when we develop a performance assessment, remember we talked about there is a task and then there's performance criteria. And the performance is, students performing some kind of, academic task. So let's say, for example, I was a sixth grade teacher, social studies teacher working on standard 2. So that standard is determine the central ideas or information of a primary or secondary source, provide an accurate, objective summary of the source, distinct from prior knowledge or opinions. Obviously, I would go through and unpack that, decide what I wanted to focus on, and then let's say I arrived at my learning target of I can read a primary source document and identify the central idea. Makes sense, right? So when I'm developing a performance assessment, remember the assessment has to match the learning target. They have to be 100% clearly aligned with one another. So if I'm looking at what my learning target is saying, students are going to read a primary source document and then they're going to identify the central idea in that document. Well, my performance assessment, the task that they do, I could have students read a political cartoon, let's say, and then state the central idea in 1 to 2 complete sentences, maybe on an index card on the way out the door. See how that's a performance assessment? They're performing a task. It's informal, it's not like a test, and it's completely aligned with the learning target. I hope that makes sense. So going forward, I want to think about the learning targets and the relationship with the formative assessments. Again, you have a formative assessment for every lesson, and that information you collect is what informs your instruction. So that data that you collect, it helps you monitor student achievement, whether they're getting the learning target or not. It is administered, even though that sounds like a very formal word, it happens while learning is occurring, right? So students don't even necessarily know that you're assessing them, you're observing them, right? It could be formal, but it also could be informal, which totally is my preference. And then the data collected is used to plan, right? And that's how it fits in the instruction assessment cycle. Well, when you write a learning target really well, they actually can be the formative assessment for that lesson. So I always say that they have to be aligned. The assessment has to measure student progress toward the target, but they can be one and the same. So let's say I'm a sixth grade teacher working on standard 1, which is citing textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly and implicitly and make logical inferences. So let's say the learning target I focused on, I was reading The Lightning Thief, and I wanted I can make inferences about Percy's character by citing evidence from the text. Right, it's more specific. I could have said, I can make inferences about a character using text evidence. Same thing, right? And that's totally aligned with the standard, and that's okay. But I have a specific text in mind because I'm planning a lesson. It's not hypothetical. So I can be specific, right? I want them to look only at Percy, not at another character. Still focused on the inferences and then using text evidence. So think about how that learning target can be the formative assessment. Think about what it's saying. I can make inferences about Percy's character by citing evidence from the text. That should be the assessment at the end of the lesson, right? Which makes sense if that's the target that students are aiming for by the end of the lesson. Does that make sense? So before you try, what I want you to think about when you're creating your learning targets is writing them in a way that it could also serve as the formative assessment. So in your lesson plan, you're going to write your learning target like a learning target, right? Because you have to use I can. But later on, when you describe what the formative assessment is, the task should already have been done because you included that kind of detail in your learning target. I hope that makes sense.